Catus, Maximus here. This time with a quick review of these Titan super low profile sacrificial reusable extractors. And they really do have that oxymoron on this statement. Self-sacrificing can be used multiple times. So I love sacrifices that I get to use multiple times. Nothing better than multiple sacrifices. These are stocked at O'Reilly's, but I did order these online for $13 a set. Some of these places are charging $20 per package, so 40 bucks for this entire set, and I was able to get it for 26. And these are the type of extractors that you would not get as your first set. That's absolutely for sure. These are something, if you already have extractors, maybe some spiral extractors. I do have some Craftsman low profiles to compare these to. You get spiral extractors first, and then you might get these for certain situations. And that's because these have a number of issues. We'll talk about that. We'll give you a closer look. The sets are fairly comprehensive. We have a 7-piece and a 5-piece set, so that'd be 12 total, going from 8mm up through 19mm, no skips. As you can see, these things are 12-point. They are indeed sintered steel, even though they're just so minimalistic that it almost seems like they're made out of plastic. The sintered steel is fine. They can be hardened, and you can see it has a carbon finish, and they can have very precise sizing and definition. The one issue with sintered steel is that it tends to, instead of stretch or crack, it's much more brittle. And that's one of the first kind of issues with these. But the idea is that they made them out of sintered steel so that they can make the tolerances super tight. So on the inside, say on the 17mm, this is super tight. We have a 17mm fastener here, and it just barely slides over the fastener. You can see how tight that really is on there. They also make it extremely tight on the outside. Now, the reason that there's before I get ahead of myself here, the reason that they do that is because it's so weak. They want, when you're using a wrench over the outside of this, the wrench is actually providing a bunch of the structure, preventing this from splitting open. However, being rounded bolt extractors, your bolt has to be really rounded, like sanded. But most people know when you strip out a bolt, it mushes over the metal, and you end up getting like these humps or burrs on the corners, or where the corners used to be, as you've pushed the metal over because it was rounded. Something like this extractor is going to be way too tight. There just isn't any space there for it to fit. So you're going to end up in a situation where you're putting on the extractor, and you're going to hammer it on there, which is going to cause it to split. And then, of course, you won't be able to use a wrench on it. One, because it's 12-point, you can't use a two-sided wrench of any type, crescent wrench or something like that. And because they size them so tightly, and it's easier for me to show on this 19mm, we have a 19mm spline drive wrench, and it is so tightly sized that this 19mm just doesn't go in there. Or excuse me, I should realize that the outside diameter is only 2mm, so you'd run a 19mm on the 17mm, a 21mm on the 19mm, which I do like that because it makes it simpler. You just use the two sizes up. Anyway, so we have the 17 that I just had. Doesn't fit in this spline drive wrench. It actually just gets stuck, and that's because spline drives tend to be very tightly machined so that they don't strip out fasteners. It actually only fits in a normal 12-point, and we can see how tightly it's fitting in that 12-point right there. So if you did hammer it over the end of the fastener, then you wouldn't be able to get the wrench on it. The wrench would just be sitting on the top because the walls would just be splayed out. But that's the idea how these work, is they're essentially a sleeve so that you can use a bigger wrench, and it has these little dog teeth in it to try to grab the sides of the fasteners. And that really kind of sums it up for these. I like these because they are part of a nice little set. I wish they did something better to organize them because they are lightweight and small, pretty easy to lose. And all they give you is a couple little plastic trays. As far as how they're sized, or I should say how much material they've removed, here we have a spiral extractor that would be for that we might use on a 17mm bolt. You always remember spiral extractors. You always get the smallest one that you can just barely fit onto the top of the bolt. That way when you screw them on, or counterclockwise screw them on to remove the fastener, that's what it's doing. These are tapered so they kind of screw themselves on, and then these sharp teeth actually just dive in and really get a good grasp of the bolt. So that's why these are recommended as the first. The second one is because you have all this big clearance area. So if you have big mushrooms of metal and big burrs where the corners used to be, you can still get a spiral extractor on there. And then, of course, the amount of material. Both of these are made for driving 17 millimeter fasteners, and we can just see that these Titans, I mean, there's just a few grams of metal right there, so definitely super weak. So that would be generally my take on these things. I think they are neat. They're great for a tool collection, and of course, there's just nothing that beats this profile. I mean, nothing is lower profile than this, because now the whole wrench and everything fits in a very tight space, and that's what kind of interested me, was the fact that you can get it over in a bolt that's next to something, be able to get this thing on there and then get a wrench in there and maintain a super duper low profile. And generally when you can use them, the idea does work, because you're using the wrench to reinforce the extractor and it being super tight fitting. Generally it will extract the bolt or make sure it is 100% round. Just make sure you're not paying like 40 bucks or too much money for these, because that's probably my biggest disappointment, was seeing some places online that were charging $20 a set, and these things just, due to the nature of being sintered steel, is super thin sintered steel bits here, just is only worth about $10 to $15 a set. And I do like that they did emboss the sizes as well as laser etch them, so it does make it a little bit easier to keep track of them. And it is a pretty comprehensive set. This is probably one of the things that I actually bought it for specifically, and they say EXR for extractor, I guess, was this little 8mm, which you can also use in 5/16, and that is a super tiny external extractor. So I think that's probably the smallest one I have, and so for me it was almost worth it just for that one bit. But I do like that it has no skips. And there are a few sizes that these will cross over on the fractional bolts, such as 13mm and 1/2 inch, 19mm and 3/4 inch, etc. So they do have a reasonable amount of versatility. You just have to be aware of their caveats, because there are many bolts that you won't even be able to get these on, and if you hammer them on, they break, and then you won't be able to get a wrench on them. And so that's really what they mean on the packaging, is if they don't break on you and you don't sacrifice them, then you will be able to use them again. So they should also be kind of cheap, because they are designed to be essentially disposable tools. And yep, there is absolutely not a single mention of the word warranty at all on these things. So they're pretty much as is when you're buying them new. But nonetheless, they are neat to add to a tool collection, because they are some pretty specialty style extractors. Oh, and one last thing I should mention before I forget is one of the reasons that they're 12-point, they could have made them 6-point. But they actually had a goal with making these 12-point, and it wasn't to make it harder to use or make it easier to use with 12-point wrenches. Although you may think that, it really has to do with the alignment of the flat, where you have this little hook piece in here, or tooth in there. And so with a 12-point, when you're putting pressure on all these points, it's also putting pressure on this point, which is right in the center of this wall. And since these are so thin, what that is doing is just providing some additional downward pressure right against these flats to help it maintain a tighter grip. I believe that's exactly why they went with 12-point instead of 6 points on these things. Anyway, I don't know how I talked so long about extractors, but I talk a long time about a lot of things. Anyway, I really appreciate everybody who's been watching and subscribing. And if you haven't subscribed, please do. Until next time, Catus Maximus out.